Every 40 seconds, somewhere on this planet, someone has a stroke. By the time you finish reading this sentence, another brain has already been hit. Every single year, stroke kills close to 6 million people worldwide. It ranks as the second leading cause of death globally and stands as the number one reason people end up with permanent disability for the rest of their lives. And the part that nobody ever tells you clearly enough is this. In a massive number of cases, the brain gives you very specific, very real warnings hours or even days before the big stroke actually happens. You just have to know what those warnings look like. Stroke is not just you were fine, you fell, and you woke up in a hospital bed. In most cases, stroke is the predictable endpoint of blood vessels that have been silently degrading for years. If something is predictable, it is at least partly preventable. That is the entire point of what you are about to read. When people say stroke, they are actually talking about two very different events happening inside the brain. The first is a hemorrhagic stroke. A blood vessel inside the brain bursts open. Blood pours into or around the brain tissue, forms a clot that compresses and crushes surrounding brain cells, and a large percentage of those patients die. The second type is an ischemic stroke. The vessel does not tear but instead gets blocked. Blood flow stops completely to a section of the brain, and brain cells in that zone begin dying in roughly 4 to 6 minutes. Ischemic strokes make up around 85% of all strokes recorded worldwide. That is the type we are going to focus on today. To understand why every single minute matters with stroke, you need a real sense of how demanding your brain actually is. Your brain weighs roughly 1.4 kilograms. That is only about 2% of your total body weight. But it consumes around 20% of the oxygen you breathe in and about 25% of all the glucose circulating through your blood at any given moment. It is a control center that never shuts off, and it needs a constant, uninterrupted fuel line to keep running. Cut that fuel for even a few minutes, and cells start dying in ways that cannot be reversed. That is why doctors say stroke is a race against time. It is literally a race to save brain tissue before it is gone permanently. Most people miss what comes next. For a brain artery to suddenly block, the groundwork was usually laid over years. The walls of the vessel have been damaged over time. Cholesterol and clots have been quietly building up inside. The opening of the vessel has been getting tighter and tighter. This is not an explosion out of nowhere. It is the final step of a long, slow process. And along that road, your body almost always sends out warning signals before the final event. The problem is nobody ever taught you how to read them. In medicine, those early warning shots are called a transient ischemic attack, or TIA for short. Transient simply means temporary. It comes and it goes. Picture a carotid artery, the main artery in your neck that carries blood from your heart all the way up to your brain. Over years, a fatty plaque forms on the inner wall of that artery, right at the point where it branches. The opening slowly narrows month by month, then at some point, the already tight vessel goes into a brief spasm. Blood flow stops for a few seconds or a few minutes, and the brain area being fed by that artery essentially blacks out for that short period. You experience a stroke symptom. Then the spasm relaxes, blood flow returns, the symptom fades, and you convince yourself everything is fine again. What research actually shows is that a transient ischemic attack very often comes right before a major ischemic stroke, typically within the next 72 hours. Those 3 days are your window, the window where the disaster can still be prevented. Most people do not use that window because the warning episode was short, strange, and then disappeared. So they talk themselves out of taking it seriously. These warning episodes usually last from about half a minute to maybe 10 minutes. That is exactly why they slip through the cracks. You can be in your kitchen, in the shower, or getting out of your car, and by the time you stop and think about it, the symptom has already passed. But each one of those episodes is your brain sending a final, very clear message. I am about to be in serious trouble. The first warning sign is temporary blindness in one eye. You get up, walk toward the kitchen, and suddenly one eye goes dark or foggy, like someone pulled down a black curtain over that eye, or smeared the lens with a layer of gray mud. You blink a few times, maybe rub the eye, and within seconds or a minute at most, the vision comes back completely. So you blame it on standing up too fast or too much screen time the night before. In reality, that curtain is almost always a tiny clot or a small fragment of plaque that broke off from the wall of your carotid artery, traveled upward, and briefly plugged the artery that feeds the eye. The artery to your eye is not some random isolated tube. It is a direct branch off the internal carotid artery, the same artery that feeds your brain. When the clot or plaque fragment wedges into that tiny eye artery, blood cannot get through. The retina, the light-sensing tissue at the back of your eye, loses its blood supply for a moment and you see darkness instead of a clear image. When the clot drifts away and blood flow restarts, the vision returns and you feel relieved. But you were lucky, because that exact same clot could have gone 2 millimeters in a different direction into a brain artery. And then instead of a 1-minute blackout in one eye, you are looking at permanent loss of speech, paralysis of an arm and leg, or death. Doctors have a Latin name for that one-eye blackout, amaurosis fugax. It literally means fleeting blindness. Neurologists treat that phrase like a fire alarm. Hospital records show a pattern where a person ignores 2 or 3 of these eye episodes, and the very next event is the full stroke in the brain. The second warning sign is sudden numbness or tingling on one side of your body. The medical term is paresthesia, but you can think of it as your skin acting drunk. It can be the whole arm, just the hand, half the face, or even one full side of the body from head to foot. It feels like pins and needles, like cotton under the skin, or like that body part has turned to rubber. The key detail is that it appears out of nowhere while you are just sitting, walking, or in the middle of a conversation. It lasts a few minutes and then disappears on its own. You have probably slept on your arm at some point where nerve compression causes numbness that clears up when you move. That is something different entirely. Your brain and spinal cord are fine in that case. You simply compressed a nerve, and as soon as blood flow and position normalize, sensation returns. With a TIA, the problem is not in the arm itself. It is in the brain area that maps sensation from that arm. One more important thing worth knowing here. Stroke symptoms are typically one-sided because each hemisphere of the brain controls and receives sensation from the opposite side of your body. When both hands go numb evenly at the same time, that more often points to a neck spine problem. But sudden one-sided numbness that resolves after a few minutes is a strong reason to get evaluated for TIA and stroke risk immediately. The third warning sign is a sudden loss of coordination, what people describe as a drunk walk without any alcohol involved. You are on a flat, familiar surface, and out of nowhere your foot lands in the wrong place. Your leg feels weak or rubbery, or you stagger into the wall for a second, or you get hit by a sudden, intense spinning sensation that makes you grab a chair or the door frame even though nothing was moving. You did not jerk your head, and you did not just stand up from bed. The part of your brain that keeps you balanced and coordinates smooth movement is called the cerebellum. It sits low in the back of your skull, like a small secondary brain. It constantly calculates where your body is in space and precisely how hard each muscle should fire, so you walk straight instead of zigzagging across the room. The cerebellum gets its blood supply from arteries that run up through the bones of your neck into the back of the skull, what doctors call the vertebrobasilar system. If blood flow in those arteries drops sharply, even for a few seconds, the cerebellum essentially glitches. That is when you suddenly veer sideways, misstep, or feel violent dizziness for no obvious reason. Benign dizziness usually has a clear trigger: rolling over in bed, turning the head quickly, or a known inner ear condition. But spontaneous intense dizziness combined with any trouble walking straight should be treated as a possible TIA until a doctor rules out a vascular cause. The fourth warning sign is in your speech. Before going further, one important clarification. If you occasionally cannot remember your neighbor's name or you temporarily forget the word for a common object, that is not a stroke warning sign. That is a normal tip of the tongue moment that happens more frequently when you are tired or stressed. What worries neurologists is something categorically different. When your speech suddenly breaks down so completely that even you can tell something is seriously wrong. There are two main speech areas in most people's brains, both typically in the left hemisphere. One area, commonly called Broca's area, helps you form words and send clear instructions to the muscles of your tongue, lips, and jaw. When that region loses blood flow, you may understand everything people say to you. You know exactly what you want to answer, but you cannot get the words out. They come out slurred, chopped, or completely stuck in your throat. The other area, commonly called Wernicke's area, helps you understand speech and organize your own sentences so they make logical sense. When that zone is in trouble, a person may speak fluently but produce complete nonsense, what doctors call word salad, and may not understand simple phrases directed at them at all. If either of those speech problems appears suddenly and then fades after a few minutes, that is classic for a TIA. You cannot ignore broken speech simply because it's self-corrected. That is like your home alarm going off, stopping on its own, and you deciding it was probably nothing. The fifth warning sign is less obvious and surprises most people who hear it. It is a specific combination of certain skin changes together with new, unusually strong headaches. The skin condition in question is vitiligo, patches of pale or completely white skin where pigment-producing cells have stopped working. Vitiligo is an autoimmune process, meaning the immune system begins attacking your own pigment cells as though they were foreign invaders. When your immune system goes off target like that, it frequently does not stop at one organ. In many people, that same autoimmune process can quietly inflame the inner lining of blood vessels as well. That inner lining is called the endothelium, a microscopically thin layer of cells that coats the inside of every artery like a super smooth non-stick surface. When the endothelium is healthy, blood flows past smoothly and nothing clings to it. When it is damaged by inflammation, it becomes rough and scarred and things start to stick to it. Cholesterol, platelets, inflammatory proteins, all forming the seeds of plaques and clots over time. Vitiligo alone does not doom you to a stroke. But if on top of that you develop frequent, unusually intense headaches that do not match your usual pattern, that combination deserves a proper vascular workup rather than a wait-and-see approach. Now, the most important question: what really wrecks your blood vessels from the inside over time? Because this is where one of the biggest myths about stroke lives. The myth is this: my cholesterol is normal, so I am safe from stroke. Stroke risk is not just about what is floating in your blood. It is very much about the condition of that endothelial lining inside your vessels. The first major enemy of the endothelium is chronically high blood sugar. Glucose is your cell's primary fuel, but to get from the blood into endothelial cells, it needs insulin, the hormone that opens the door. When your body does not make enough insulin or your cells become resistant to it, you can have plenty of sugar in the blood while the vessel lining cells are simultaneously starving. Starving cells get damaged, lose their shape, and can even peel off the inner surface, leaving behind rough scar-like patches that become perfect landing pads for bad cholesterol, platelets, and other blood components. This process begins years before anyone officially tells you that you have diabetes. Even mild prediabetes, where your glucose is only slightly above normal, is enough to quietly injure the endothelium for a long time. The second major vascular enemy is smoking. With every cigarette, toxic compounds hit the inner surface of your vessels and cause direct chemical damage and sustained inflammation. At the same time, nicotine and carbon monoxide make your blood thicker and stickier, increasing how easily platelets clump together and how readily clots form. When you combine a damaged, inflamed vessel wall with thick, sticky blood, you create ideal conditions for a clot to lodge in a brain artery. That is why smokers have roughly 2 to 4 times the risk of an ischemic stroke compared to non-smokers with similar cholesterol and blood pressure numbers. Now, what do you do if you have already experienced even one of those 5 warning episodes, even if it felt minor and vanished in under 10 minutes? You have roughly 72 hours where a great deal can still be done to prevent a full-blown stroke. The goal is not to panic, but it is also not to waste that window. Stroke specialists consistently point out how important it is not to be completely alone after a suspected transient attack. If another more serious episode happens and you suddenly cannot speak or move, you need another person nearby who can see what is happening, call emergency services, and reach you quickly. Checking blood pressure is usually among the first steps in almost any acute situation. If the top number, the systolic pressure, is around 180 or higher, and the bottom number, the diastolic, is around 110 or higher, that fits the picture of a hypertensive crisis. Calling emergency services immediately is what standard guidelines recommend in that situation. One rule from stroke medicine is absolute. Never start blood-thinning drugs like aspirin or anticoagulants on your own based on a friend's advice or something you read online. There are two main types of stroke: ischemic, where a vessel is blocked, and hemorrhagic, where a vessel is actively bleeding. Thinning the blood can help in certain ischemic situations, but in a hemorrhagic stroke, it can make the bleeding faster and larger, which can kill a person far more rapidly. The only way to reliably tell the difference is with brain imaging, usually a CT scan performed in a hospital. No doctor on earth can look at someone and be 100% certain which type is occurring without a scan. So instead of self-treating, the right move is to get evaluated immediately and let a medical team make that decision. There are 3 evaluations that are completely reasonable to ask your doctor about if you have experienced any of these warning signs. The first is a specialized ultrasound of your neck arteries called carotid duplex ultrasound. Unlike a basic ultrasound that only shows structure, duplex imaging shows both the anatomy of the artery and how blood is actually flowing through it, including whether flow speeds up and becomes turbulent at a narrowed segment. If the carotid artery is narrowed by more than roughly 70% by plaque, doctors call that hemodynamically significant stenosis, meaning the narrowing is severe enough to seriously impair blood flow. The second test is a blood test called glycated hemoglobin, or HbA1c. This reflects your average blood sugar level over approximately 3 months rather than just a single morning snapshot. It is especially powerful at catching the gray zone called pre-diabetes, where sugar has been high enough long enough to damage vessels, but nobody has yet labeled it as diabetes. The cutoffs are clear. Under 5.7% is normal. Between 5.7 and 6.4% is pre-diabetes. At 6.5% or higher, it typically meets the criteria for diabetes. The third investigation is Holter monitoring of the ECG, meaning a 24-hour heart rhythm recording worn while you go about your normal daily routine. The reason is straightforward. Some dangerous heart rhythm problems come and go. They might appear once or twice a day for only a few seconds and be completely missed by a short snapshot ECG in the clinic. The biggest rhythm culprit for stroke is atrial fibrillation. In atrial fibrillation, the upper chambers of the heart stop beating in a steady, organized way and instead quiver chaotically, sometimes at rates of 300 to 400 contractions per minute. Blood does not empty smoothly from the chambers. It churns and swirls instead of flowing, and in that swirling blood, clots form very easily. Those clots can travel straight up to the brain and lodge in an artery. Many people with atrial fibrillation do not feel dramatic symptoms. At most, they notice occasional skipped beats or brief flutters that they blame on stress or too much caffeine. If atrial fibrillation is found, there are well-studied medications called anticoagulants that, when prescribed and monitored correctly, can cut the stroke risk in this condition by roughly 60 to 70%. Stepping all the way back, stroke is not a lightning bolt from a clear sky. It is a predictable event that usually comes after years of silent vessel damage, and it almost always announces itself in advance. You now know the 5 major warnings: brief blindness in one eye, sudden one-sided numbness or tingling, abrupt loss of coordination or a drunk walk, sudden serious speech breakdown, and vitiligo combined with new unusual headaches. Any single one of these appearing for the first time, even if it vanishes within a minute, is a reason to speak to a doctor urgently and ask about those 3 evaluations: carotid duplex ultrasound, glycated hemoglobin, and Holter ECG monitoring. On the prevention side, keeping blood sugar in a healthy range and catching pre-diabetes early protects the endothelium and slows plaque growth. Managing blood pressure carefully with your doctor's guidance reduces strain on vessels and lowers both hemorrhagic and ischemic risk. Stopping smoking removes a constant chemical assault on your arteries and cuts your ischemic stroke risk by a factor of 2 to 4 over time. And the most important thing of all to take away from everything covered here: do not wait for brief brain symptoms to resolve on their own and pretend they never happened. In the world of stroke medicine, you have about 72 hours to act. Use that window. Write down what happened in plain language. Bring that written description to a doctor. Ask directly whether you should be evaluated for transient ischemic attacks. Everything here is for your education and understanding. Your specific situation requires a real conversation with your own doctor. But use what you learned here to make that conversation specific, direct, and actionable, rather than walking away with everything looks fine and no actual numbers to show for it.